welcome to PankStep's Pank Steps for Managing ADHD. This is my workshop for preschool and kindergarten teachers with the goal of better understanding ADHD in children and how we can best support them as they develop. Let me begin by introducing myself. I am Dr. Jaak Pankstep. Much of my work focused on the connections between social play and ADHD, as well as how our environment shapes who we are. Today, we'll be examining the links between these ideas and how current neuroscience research supports and expands some of the claims that I've made. So, as teachers of young children, I'm sure you've encountered students who have had trouble focusing on school activities and had too much energy to sit still in the classroom. Children like this are commonly diagnosed and treated for ADHD, but let's talk about what the actual criteria for this disorder are. To help me today, I have my research assistants, Kim, Callie, Anna, and Andy.
ADHD stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. According to recent statistics published by the CDC, ADHD is a behavioral disorder that affects approximately 11% of children ages 4 to 17 in the United States, and those rates are only continuing to increase. ADHD symptoms can appear in toddlers as early as 3 and 6 years old. The DSM-5 defines ADHD as a persistent pattern of inattention and/or hyperactivity impulsivity that interferes with functioning or development, and it outlines the medical classification of its associated behavioral symptoms. When you're diagnosed with ADHD, you can have symptoms of inattention or hyperactivity or both. Most people are diagnosed with both. Specific symptoms of inattention include, but are not limited to, failing to give close attention to detail or making mistakes, having difficulty sustaining attention in tasks or activities, and not listening when spoken to directly. Specific symptoms of hyperactivity include, but are not limited to, talking excessively, having difficulty waiting your turn, and interrupting or intruding on others.
ADHD has a heritability score of around 60%, indicating that it is, in fact, a heritable disorder. However, there's not one ADHD gene that causes the disorder to appear, like a gene for blue eyes or for Huntington's disease. Instead, the heritability of ADHD depends on a collection of endophenotypes, which are heritable traits that predispose someone to developing a disorder, and these genetic predispositions interact with environmental conditions to contribute to the symptoms that we diagnose as ADHD. Currently, treatment for ADHD usually involves medications. Psychostimulants have proved incredibly useful for decreasing hyperactivity and other ADHD symptoms. I can give you a prescription for Adderall or Ritalin
Wait, I'm going to cut them off right there. Prescriptions of psychostimulants like Adderall or Ritalin are very common in the treatment of ADHD in children. However, I believe it might be a better idea to first attempt behavioral intervention and therapy before jumping straight to medication. So I'm proposing a new idea: the use of social play as an alternative to psychostimulants for the prevention and treatment of ADHD. So Anna, what is social play?
Let's take a look at what social play actually is and why it is important. There are many types of play that are important in general because they help children develop creativity as well as imagination. Social play is important because it teaches children to work together and develop important social skills for life. Aspects of social play develop around 3 or 4 years of age. Associative play and cooperative play are two forms of social play. Associative play is when two children interact with each other, sharing toys and talking, but are not organized in their play and have no common goal. Cooperative play is when children work together during play to achieve a common goal, and leaders and followers begin to emerge. An example of this could be children building a castle with Legos or playing kickball with a team of peers. Social play is also thought to facilitate healthy emotional regulation, learning about physical and emotional boundaries, assessing risks, and being socially sensible. These are things which have been found to decrease in children with ADHD. This may be because children with ADHD have been found to exhibit more solitary play than their peers, which does not facilitate or develop social skills like interactive play does. In a clinical setting, social play may be used to help children with ADHD. This is called social play therapy. The central ideas of social play therapy include the use of intrinsic motivation through the natural context of human interaction and the development of interpersonal empathy.
The existence of social play in many mammalian species suggests that it has some evolutionary importance. Dr. Panksepp thinks that the human genome does not contain enough information to construct a fully social brain. Play and the many other basic emotional systems of ancient regions of the brain are the tools that allow the social brain to develop. Essentially, the brain comes with a variety of tools that build the brain from a common foundation based on various environmental factors. These tools are subcortical, and everything we build is stored in the neocortex. Evidence does suggest that social play can actively shape our brains. Changes in the body during and after play involve switching certain genes on and off. One study not only found that play activates the entire neocortex, but also the expression of about a third of the 1,200 genes that were measured were found to be significantly changed after only 30 minutes of social play. What's really interesting is that many of these genes express growth factor proteins, which are vital to development and growth of the brain. Other studies have also found that play increases the transcription of brain-derived neurotrophic factors in rats, which is also important in building the brain. Now that we have evidence that play can physically shape the brain, let's get a bit more into the specifics.
That's exactly right, Kim. And here's where it gets really fascinating. A major role of the frontal lobe is executive functioning, which includes behavioral inhibition. This refers to our ability to stop, look, listen, and feel. This developing inhibition provides increasing behavioral flexibility and goal-directed behavior as we age, allowing us to essentially fine-tune our behavior in different situations. For example, behavioral inhibition allows us to focus in the classroom by stopping our impulsive emotional urges. My work over the past few decades has alluded to these concepts, but now we've taken even more information and formed an integrated hypothesis. First, it seems that social play facilitates the development of the frontal lobe, or prefrontal cortex. As this occurs, the prefrontal cortex becomes increasingly able to inhibit social play behavior in various contexts, which allows for that fine-tuning of behavior. However, if a child is put into a classroom setting at an age where this process is still occurring, the decrease in social play prevents the prefrontal cortex from developing properly. As a result, we see symptoms we've come to associate with ADHD. What we're actually seeing, however, is a set of compensatory behaviors that arise to facilitate the continued development of the prefrontal cortex. The symptoms of ADHD, therefore, are a combination of excessive social play behavior and an underdevelopment of the frontal lobe's context-specific inhibitory function. In nature, the timeline of this process shows natural variation, but because we have a rigid timeline for schooling, children who happen to develop more slowly may never be given the opportunity to fully develop their prefrontal cortex and therefore their executive functioning. This means that the behaviors displayed by people with ADHD aren't actually pathological until you force that child into a restrictive school environment.
So what role do psychostimulants play? These drugs tend to artificially increase frontal lobe inhibition of innate urges such as play. We're going to argue that yes, these medications are effective in improving classroom attention, but in reality, they're treating the symptoms, not the root of the problem. On top of this, these drugs are amphetamines and have comparable effects to low doses of cocaine. We don't yet have a clear picture of how they might affect development, but we do have some evidence that psychostimulant prescriptions increase the risk of addiction later in life and may affect how the brain develops throughout childhood. Because of this, we suggest social play interventions as an alternative to immediate medication for the treatment and prevention of ADHD. But what's the evidence that this actually works? Several studies have been conducted to assess the long-term behavioral changes associated with social play therapy. During these play intervention sessions, a clinician supervised a play period involving the parent and a peer of the affected child that took place in the children's natural, everyday social setting, like their home or daycare. These interventions increased social play with peers up to 18 months post-therapy and increased social skills in the home, clinical settings, and educational areas 12 months post-therapy. From studies like these, we have evidence that play therapy can have long-term behavioral impacts for children with ADHD that generalize to more than just one single setting.
So let's go back to our hypothesis and first look at the prefrontal cortex, the area associated with social behavior, personality, and decision-making, as well as its involvement with both ADHD and social play. ADHD is defined as a behavioral disorder by the DSM-5, but it has also been found to be a neurodevelopmental disorder. This means that different parts of the ADHD brain grow at irregular rates, whether this means they develop too quickly or too slowly. From current research, we can see the prefrontal cortex shows predominant structural changes in people with ADHD. Specifically, this includes a thinning and volume reduction of the cortex, including prefrontal regions, as well as delayed development of these areas. When we look at the functioning of the cortex, we see that patients with ADHD presented hyperactivity in parts of the frontal and parietal lobes. These findings align with what we already know because in the DSM-5 diagnostic outline, we learn that deficits in behavioral inhibition are highly correlated with ADHD. And it has been found that executive functions like these are in fact regulated by the frontal cortex. People with ADHD can have trouble in social situations and making and keeping friends. They feel awkward, left out, and can even develop social anxiety because social behavior does not come as naturally to them. And this all makes sense because we now know that this stems from the irregularity of the development of the prefrontal cortex.
The frontal cortex has also been studied in the context of social play behavior in various animal models, with most of this work focusing on social play in rats. Specifically, rats show higher levels of a marker of neuronal activity in the prefrontal cortex following social play bouts. This shows that the frontal cortex is implicated in social play involving interactions with other animals. An animal's behavior will likely change depending on the context of this interaction, which is similar to how a child must modulate their behavior in different settings, such as at school or at home. The brain builds new circuits in the prefrontal cortex to help it navigate these complex social interactions. Studies have been done that remove the frontal cortex of neonatal rats, and this has been found to impact the nature of social play behavior, specifically the structure of social play, such as the amount of time spent engaged in a play bout. Another feature of rodent social play is that a rat will change the way that it engages in social play depending on the dominant status of its partner, and this adjustment is not seen in rats without a cortex. Finally, lesions of the frontal cortex lead to increased social play and hyperactivity in rats. Taken together, this information tells us that the frontal cortex is not responsible for the development of social play, but rather points to a role of the frontal cortex in fine-tuning social play behavior. As we mentioned previously, play initiates the expression of genes that support growth of the cortex. When this process is disrupted, the frontal cortex may not fully develop, which causes the behaviors associated with ADHD. The experience of play may facilitate more natural development of neuronal connections within the frontal cortex. But the prefrontal cortex does not work in isolation, so how does it communicate with other areas of the brain involved in ADHD and social play?
One way of understanding the implications of ADHD and play on other areas of the brain is through neurotransmitter pathways within our brain. The main neurochemical research behind ADHD has focused on how neurotransmitters affect brain development and behaviors. There are two main systems that researchers have focused on: the adrenergic system, which regulates smooth muscle functioning, and the dopaminergic system, which is involved in motivation or reward behavior, as well as movement. Let's take a look at some of these pathways. Focusing in on the dopaminergic system, one area where dopamine is produced in the brain is called the ventral tegmental area. This area is activated when we experience something rewarding, and dopamine-producing neurons project to different areas of the brain. We can think of something rewarding, in this case, being social interaction with others through social play. It has been found that rats with decreased dopaminergic production pathways exhibit symptoms that coincide with symptoms of ADHD in human children. One of these dopamine pathways is called the mesocortical dopamine pathway. The mesocortical pathway connects to the prefrontal cortex and is involved in the executive function of this area. The input of dopamine to the prefrontal cortex is also thought to play a critical role in normal cognitive processes, motivation, and emotional responding. Another pathway is the mesolimbic dopamine pathway. This pathway connects to the striatum, a part of the brain's reward system. The striatum consists of the caudate, the putamen, and the nucleus accumbens. Studies on the striatum have shown that patients with ADHD have volume reduction in the right putamen, one of the parts of this brain area. PET scans in humans have also shown that the brain of people with ADHD have fewer inhibitory connections within the striatum area. This means there is more activity projected to this area, which may cause a net increase in striatal excitability in those with ADHD. These dopamine pathways are also very important for social play. A recent study in 2014 found increased neural activity in areas of the striatum to which the prefrontal cortex projects.
Now that we've explained how these areas are implicated in ADHD and play, let's turn our attention back to psychostimulants. Adderall and Ritalin increase dopamine in the frontal cortex and striatum and actually decrease juvenile play fighting in rats. Actually, I say in one of my papers that psychostimulants used to treat ADHD are among the most powerful social play-reducing drugs ever discovered through the use of animal models. Since we know that play facilitates the physical development and growth of the brain, providing children with this kind of medication at a young age is contrary to the goal of ADHD treatment. In fact, we do have evidence indicating that psychostimulant usage stunts brain development. A 2009 study found that adolescents taking psychostimulants showed a slower rate of change in cortical thickness compared to adolescents not taking psychostimulants. By preventing play and the proper development of behavioral inhibition, psychostimulants simply mask the symptoms while leaving the underlying problem unchanged, and actually prevent proper development. We are arguing that it makes more sense to facilitate proper social play to fully and effectively develop the prefrontal cortex and eliminate the compensatory symptoms of ADHD. Returning to our hypothesis and its application, we propose that increasing social play in your classroom will allow the children to fully use the innate evolutionary tools of the mammalian brain for proper cortical development. Those with ADHD will also benefit from this increase in structured social play and additional play therapy by restoring the proper developmental trajectory in the prefrontal cortex. This leads to an overall healthier and more fully developed brain that properly functions throughout the lifetime. I want to give a huge thank you to my research assistants for all of their hard work. Thank you all for coming!